welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for this webinar put on by the APDVS. I think it's going to be really an excellent and informative session here, talking about achieving success in education research for the vascular surgeon. We're very fortunate to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts here in educational research who are going to share their knowledge with us and insight to help us gain a little more of a comprehensive understanding of this field of research and the tools that are available to us. We'll kick it off at the end. There will be 15 minutes left for a Q&A session. So if you do have any questions that come up, you can feel free to put them in the chat as we go along, but we'll get to them at the end. I guess without further ado, we'll start off with Dr. Gurjit Sandhu, who is a professor in the Department of Surgery at the University of Michigan. She's a national leader in surgical education with quantitative and qualitative research expertise in teaching methods and assessment. She will start by providing an overview of education research domains, associated methodologies, and study design. Go ahead, Gurjit.
Great. Thank you, Anna, and thank you all for the invitation and that very kind introduction. We'll go ahead and share. Anna, could you just give me a thumbs up if that looks okay? Dr. Bonikowski? Great. Okay, so I'll get started here. So in the next approximately 15 minutes, we'll have a review of an introduction to surgical education, specifically as a primer focused on vascular surgeons. Hide that. So again, thank you for the opportunity to connect around surgical education research. In light of the time we have, I want to be transparent. This is very much dipping our toes into the water kind of a talk. So as vascular surgeons, I imagine you're participating in this conversation because you're curious about observations and performance in your specialty. Perhaps you're thinking about how to turn that curiosity into a question that can be explored and studied. And you're maybe even thinking about how to take some findings and apply them back into practice. Okay? So all of those lend themselves to surgical education research. I've got 3 objectives I'd like to cover in the next 15 minutes. First is to describe some, not all, key domains of surgical education research, such as assessment, curriculum development, simulation, identity and culture, and then some workforce system level studies. The next objective is around identifying some common research methods used in surgical education, such as simulation-based studies, survey research, qualitative methods, quantitative methods, and linking those to large data sets. And finally, I want to review 5 examples of surgical education research from vascular surgery and general surgery to demonstrate some alignment of educational questions with study design and findings that are relevant to all of you as vascular surgeons. So let's begin. I guess, can I see the chat, Joanna, or no?
You might,
maybe
you
not.
have to bring it up, but we will monitor the chat for you.
Okay, so maybe you could tell me some of the comments that get put in there. So if you don't mind popping a few of your responses to these questions into the chat, that will help us out. So in your professional life, what are some things that bug you or that irritate you? Something you're curious about, just on a day-to-day in your practice. Joanna, are there some things popping in there that you could share with us?
We have interruptions.
Okay. If there's anything else comes in, let me know. I've heard things like struggling learners. How do I work with learners who are struggling? How do I receive feedback? How do I provide feedback? How do we know what we're doing is actually leading to competent residents who we are comfortable graduating? So all of these things are questions or curiosities, things that might bug you. those are the seeds with which you can start to explore surgical education research projects. Okay, so this is a rapidly evolving field. Anything from your attention to well-being to competency-based education, I would argue, falls in this realm of surgical education research. And education research really helps us make that shift intentionally in the best interest of surgeons, trainees, and patients. All right, so this is a working definition, and it's something that I've been playing with, so it's not published anywhere, so we can continue to refine this. This is how I think about surgical education research. It's the systematic study of teaching, learning, assessment, performance, and lived experiences of surgeons across the educational continuum. The aim is to generate evidence that informs and improves individual competency, the quality of training programs, and ultimately patient outcomes. So in particular, I want to draw your attention to across the educational continuum. So this recognizes that there are different domains of education that we can query, and this can apply to medical students, residents, fellows, and practicing surgeons. So it's quite a wide net that we're casting. Now, this comes from Palmquist and colleagues, and these are some of the most common subjects studied in surgical education research. So on the left-hand side, you'll see curriculum and teaching, assessment, program evaluation, new technologies, and well-being. And then you'll also note that there's a category called other, which I'll draw your eyes to the right-hand side of the screen. That includes things like case exposure, duty hours, call schedule, the cost of living, international graduates, global surgery rotations, diversity, mentorship. Again, the idea is these are all permutations of education that can be queried. Now, none of these rose high enough to be independently charted on the left-hand side, but you can see how all of those are worthy of inquiry, and they're being lumped together in this figure as other. All right, so another question Palmquist and colleagues explored was what research designs are commonly employed? And so some of the most commonly used research designs are descriptive studies, comparative studies, experimental, qualitative, and mixed methods. And another question they asked was, what data gathering strategies are commonly used? Here they identified observations, surveys and questionnaires, using available data, so ACGME milestones data, for example, and then interviews. Now, thinking about clinical research, which is probably where most of you are familiar, the research design, the methodology, and the methods all need to line up in order to answer a question. And if you're exploring perceptions or experiences, qualitative or survey-based methods might be what you go with. Okay? If you're testing relationships between training and outcomes, then you may want to use large data sets and statistical models. And if you're looking at assessment and curriculum development, you may have a mixed methods approach. I want to pause here. I know I threw a lot of jargon and terminology out there. It's mostly just to wash over you. This is the best that we can do in this time that we have, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. All right, so let's take a look at five studies illustrating 5 domains. And then I did put a red box there, additional areas of study, just to remind us that these are not the only 5 domains that are possible. There are lots of other ways that we can study surgical education research. So we'll tackle these one at a time, and I'll illustrate using a study for each of them. So the first one we'll have a look at is around simulation. So the domain we're looking at is simulation, and simulation is typically about how to teach and assess safely before patients are involved. Okay? Focus here in this study was around instrumented bench suturing simulator, patterned after the clock face radial suturing model from Fundamentals of Vascular Surgery. Okay? The method that was used was motion tracking. And so that's what they used during simulation to assess suturing skills. And this study is a really nice example of objective metrics in simulation-based education. For the findings and outcomes, what they had were movements were tracked and analyzed, revealing measurable differences between experience levels. So in this study, they've provided evidence for the effectiveness of rotational motion analysis in assessing suturing skills. So this study is a nice example of how simulation research and technology can quantify subtle surgical skills. Let's move to the next one. So this is Dr. Smith and team, and they looked at ACGME milestones ratings and early outcomes for surgeons. Okay. The domain here for education is workforce and systems. And what we mean by that is how do training environments shape long-term outcomes? Typically, that's kind of how we're thinking about it. The methods they used here was to link ACGME milestones ratings during training to patient outcomes following EVAR in the VQI registry. So this pertains to surgeons in independent practice. Okay. Now, this is a very strong and unique illustration of using existing data sets. For the findings and outcomes, the milestones assessment of surgical trainees were associated with subsequent clinical outcomes in early career surgeons. So this is an excellent example of how performance in training may predict real-world outcomes, and it's also a call for more longitudinal thinking and tracking. All right, our next study comes from Riley and team, and here the domain I'd like to illustrate is professional identity and culture. And typically when we think about identity and culture, we are talking about values and beliefs associated with surgeons. The methods they used in this study was a cross-sectional survey, and the researchers surveyed vascular trainees about their experiences with virtual interviews. And for the findings and outcomes, the study supported continued hybrid approaches to interviews and trainee engagement. And the findings highlighted perceptions of equity, connection, and institutional culture. So this is a survey-based study, and it still requires thoughtful design, especially when exploring issues of diversity and inclusion. And I want to highlight that it's a thoughtful design because sometimes we think that throwing together a survey and sending it out online is an easy way to conduct an education study. I'm going to argue that it takes just as much discipline to do that as any other education research study. Our next example comes from Schmeirer and colleagues, and here the domain is assessment. So assessment is typically about asking questions like, are we measuring what matters in training? The methods they used here were Mezig's framework for examining the content, internal structure, and response processes. So Mezig's framework is a mechanism by which to gather validity evidence. And the researchers gathered validity evidence on fundamental of the vascular surgery skills assessment. So what were their findings or outcomes? The validity evidence of FVS assessment in this study supports its use in general surgery residency at a time when opportunities for open vascular surgery skills assessment may be decreasing due to case availability and shifting paradigms, right? So everything needs to be really intentional in training. So this is a nice study explaining why FVS needs to stay in the curriculum. Okay. The next study comes from Weaver and colleagues, and the domain here would be around curricular development. Now, curriculum development is typically about how we design experiences that promote competency and confidence. The methods that this team used in this study were a combination of pre-post surveys with qualitative interviews. And with respect to their findings or outcomes, there were improvements in the mentee's confidence for all domains of peer review that were evaluated, including overall confidence in peer review, study novelty, study design, analytic approach, and review formatting. And this study is a really lovely example for developing, implementing, and evaluating a curriculum with both rigor and relevance. Again, reviewing a curriculum just takes just as much discipline as any other education research design. And finally, I want to draw attention to this idea of additional areas of study. You may have noticed that I said curriculum is one domain, but then it also came up in a previous study. That is rather intentional. These are not silos. Education research often involves flowing amongst different domains of study. So for example, the virtual interview study is about culture and it's also about recruitment. So you have a couple of domains. The peer review academy study is about curriculum, but it's also about faculty development. So in light of all of that, where do you start? So here are some tips. So the first is to identify a research question. What are you curious about? What bugs you on a daily basis? Okay, what keeps you sort of thinking about a question and talking to your colleagues about it? Then talk to some folks. All the folks on this panel, your colleagues that are on this webinar, talk to them, reach out to them. Also reach out to authors who are on publications. Folks actually enjoy talking about their work, so just email them. Next, go to the literature. What's known about the topic? Where do you see a gap? What makes this question actually worth studying? Next, think about methodology. What's the lens that you're looking at this question with? Are you looking at it from a lens of gender? Are you looking at it from a lens of competency? What is your approach? And finally, start to build your team. Research, just like surgery, I don't need to tell all of you, is a team sport. So think about who can be on your team. Those were my learning objectives. And thank you.
Thank you, Gurjeet. Does anyone have any pressing questions at this point? I know we'll do a kind of more comprehensive Q&A at the end, but if there's anything. Also, I think, did you guys see if the chat's not working to put everything in the Q&A box? Okay. All right. Great. Thank you, Gurjeet. Next off, we have Bridget Smith, who will give us an overview of research databases and how to access them. Dr. Smith is a professor at the University of Wisconsin, where she serves as Vice Chair of Surgical Education. She also serves on the Vascular Surgery Board of the ABS and Board of Directors for the ACGME. She has extensive research experience utilizing multiple large education data sets and linking these to large clinical data sets. So without further ado, here's Bridget.
Thanks so much for the invitation to talk about this. And it was a lovely kickoff from Dr. Sandhu. So thank you for that and for including and highlighting one of my favorite studies that I'm quite proud of. So related to that, the reason I'm here is to talk to you a little bit about data sources and access. Make sure I can advance my slides. So one of the things I wanted to start with here is just a comment about an observation about research. And what we usually think of in clinical research and clinical care, we understand outcomes research, health services, basic science, and clinical trials, and all of that makes a whole lot of sense to us as clinicians. And then maybe sometimes we get around to implementation, which isn't well published work, but in our own institutions, we're always kind of doing this QI work to try to improve patient care. And I think education research has a little bit of the reverse problem. Like we live kind of in the QI space where we end up doing a lot of local projects in our own institutions, in our own programs to improve the quality of what we're doing. We do local needs assessments, we do curricular interventions in our own programs, pre-post tests, and kind of write about that. And I think a lot of that really falls under this quality improvement domain, where what we're really trying to talk about and push you all to think about tonight is education in terms of research and coming up with new evidence for best practices, as opposed to just kind of some of the usual things we see with implementation science, which is important, of course, but we're focusing on the research end of the equation there. So what data might be useful for you in doing education research projects? And how do we measure educational success, I think, is really what we're asking. So if we're going to do a study to investigate the success of a curriculum or a simulation exercise or et cetera, what are those data sources? And I'm going to talk mostly about sort of readily available or already collected data sources. One other comment are these two different frameworks that are commonly used in education research, Kirkpatrick's and Miller's pyramids. Kirkpatrick's refers to programs evaluating the success of programs or curricula and has these levels that you can measure the outcomes with. Level 1 being the reaction of the learners. Did they like it? Level 2 is the learning, 3 behavioral change, and 4 organizational performance. And then Miller's is referring to learners specifically, so assessment of learning. And at the foundation of that pyramid is that the learner knows something, and then proceeding upwards knows how, shows how, and does. And most often in education research, we tend to see people focusing on these lower parts of the pyramid. Did they like it? Did they learn something? And certainly that's low-hanging fruit, an important place to start. But I would encourage everyone to try to strive for higher levels of the pyramid when we're trying to think about how we evaluate our programs and how we assess for learning. So what education metrics might we consider? I just brainstormed a giant list and threw it out there for you and tried to organize my brain starting kind of in the UME space and then working through GME, thinking about all the different data that's out there that might tell us something about how we're doing with our education. How many students match into the integrated program from your medical school, for example? How many students obtain their residency of choice? What is performance like on the V-site, RPVI, qualifying and certifying exams? We have data about operative experience and volume, milestones, end of rotation evaluations, and the list goes on. And so this is just to point out, like, if you're thinking about the thing that bugs you and the question that you want to ask, think creatively about what the measure could be that would show you the answer to that question. One of the big things I can contribute to this conversation is who owns the data. I think that's a big area of question, and there's some common misconceptions about what data you have the ability to access, what's publicly accessible, and who or what organizations you go to request information. And I will start by saying that the APDVS itself as an organization is mostly crickets if you ask for data. The APDVS doesn't own or house a great deal of educational data. We do have a directory about programs and the trainees that are in them and contact information, which is appealing for many people who are interested in contacting our learners or our program directors for surveys or interviews or the like. But aside from that, things like the V-site, milestones, etc., don't live under the APDVS umbrella. So you have to think more broadly about all these other different medically related organizations that have major resources in big data that's comprehensive and national. So the American Medical Association is the first that I'll mention. The AMA has a really cool data set that's called the Physician Professional Data Set. It was previously called the AMA Physician Master File. And this is a data source where they track physician education and training, where you went to med school, where you went to residency, fellowship, what specialty you end up in, demographics, licensure status, board certification, the practice environment you're in, et cetera, et cetera. And it also includes identifiers like your medical education number, which is a unique AMA designated number, and also linked to NPI number, which is important when you start to think about how you want to connect different data sets, that you know what they have available to make that link. And the physician professional data file has NPI. I don't unfortunately have a specific cost that I can offer for you. I emailed and investigated to try to get some numbers or ballparks to share, and they really just kept saying it depends on how much data, what the volume is, what the nature is of the data. So you can email, contact them to request data, and it is a pay-to-play situation. And I'm sorry, I can't give you a better sense of cost. Gurjeet, do you know cost on AMA Physician Master File?
I also don't know. Sorry.
No, okay. Just checking if other experts knew. The AAMC, another organization to consider, Association of American Medical Colleges. The AAMC pulls data from multiple different sources. So they will pull in some data from the AMA. They will pull in some data from different DO organizations. So they house a lot of data under their umbrella, some of which is theirs and some of which they bring in. So they'll have things like MCAT scores, reapplications to medical school, faculty salary data, a lot of data about medical school operations, physician workforce data, and of course, ERAS, which I'll get to on the next slide. So for the AAMC, it's really easy. There's a form on their website. You fill it out with your study question and the data fields that you want from them, and they will respond with if they think it's feasible or not and what the price would be. And I've worked with a few different people on research projects from the AAMC over the years, so the data price ranges anywhere from 500 to 5,000, and I'm sure that that can go up depending on what you're asking for, but decently reasonable if you feel like you've got a study question that's really valuable and worth the effort to do that. Part of the AAMC is the Electronic Residency Application Service, or ERAS. This is one where it's important to highlight that the population that's captured is anyone who checks the box of vascular surgery, whether they end up getting an interview, whether they end up submitting a rank list. ERAS is really big and comprehensive. So it'll have residency applicants to vascular by gender, US, IMG, DO status, the average number of applicants for different types. Now they have lots of information about signal data for the specialties that are doing signaling, as well as geographic preference data and some ethnicity data. So a lot of this is available by public report. And I would argue that if you're simply taking publicly reported data and compiling it in a descriptive way to report back, perhaps it's more of an audit than a research project. So I would consider you to think big, like how could you take this data and link it to something else that really answers an important question? The National Resident Matching Program is another popular one to look at for data that has a public report available. Again, this is population excludes applicants that did not interview. So you can see MD grads, DO grads, Canadian status, international status, the number of positions available and filled, and the number of applicants who obtained positions or who did not match, and lots more. I'm not comprehensive on these slides, but the websites are actually really quite excellent. It's almost surprising how forthcoming all these organizations are that they want to tell you what type of data they have available and try to be helpful if they can. The American Board of Surgery and the Vascular Surgery Board of the ABS is the group that owns the data for the V-Site, the qualifying and certifying exams, and continuous certification. They only recently started gathering demographic data, so race, ethnicity type data. It doesn't go back very far in the archives. They have an online application form that's very user-friendly, very easy to use. It used to be a Google spreadsheet. Now it's a little bit of a different format. I just looked at the updated one earlier today. And your application is reviewed by the research committee of the ABS, which includes representation from vascular surgery, among other ABS specialties. They'll provide you feedback. They'll give you a yes or no decision and an explanation for that decision. And if they accept your proposal and partner with you, they'll assign you a liaison from the research committee that works with you throughout the process of doing your research study. The ACGME has, of course, op logs by year, CPT code, identifiers for individuals and programs, and continuous and longitudinal data by PGY year. Some of the ACGME op log data, many of you may know, is publicly available on their website. That's cumulative data, so like end of residency totals, without identifiers for individuals or programs. So there are some questions that can be answered with that publicly available data, but taking the time to get the identifiers and the additional depth and granularity of data the ACGME houses is probably worth it for some questions and topics. And then, of course, a lot of the work I have done is with Milestones, that they also have complete national data, full reporting every 6 months of all the Milestones ratings across all of our programs. So there's a lot that can be done there. The ACGME, I will say, I have found to be very forthcoming and interested in collaborating, but they don't have as good of a process in place as the board does right now. There's not just like a straightforward forum you can go to, but they do have a chief of research, and that's someone who you can reach out to by email. And I think the main limitation with ACGME is largely bandwidth. There's also data at the ACGME regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion type initiatives. That's important to consider, and I know some leadership at the APDVS was working on that as well. I think the same is true there to go through the chief of research. The National Board of Medical Examiners is another data source to consider. That would include all the step exams, shelf exams, and a variety of different demographic pieces of information. They also have an online form. You submit a very brief proposal and they'll tell you accept or reject. If they accept this very mini, quick little proposal, then you can write a more comprehensive full proposal. And cost is unclear for them as well. I do think there is an associated cost, and it, again, depends on the volume and type of data.